very, very warm welcome to our participants, to our speakers, to this particular webinar of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. My name is Christina Voigt. I'm the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and a professor of law at the University of Oslo in Norway. This webinar today towards a zero draft on the international instrument to address plastic pollution, including on the marine environment, is part of a webinar series of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. The webinar series is titled The Transformative Power of Law Addressing Global Environmental Challenges. And we look in our webinars at legal developments, recent legal developments, in particular in relationship to meetings of parties, new treaty law, contemporary developments, and try to get experts with us to discuss what is happening, what are the implications, what are the results, and what can we expect as next steps. I will be briefly introducing our speakers today. I just wanted to let our participants know that there will be possibilities for a quick round of questions and answers after we've heard the two interventions. You can raise your hand. You can also type your questions in the Q&A session. Please use the Q&A and not the chat, and I'll try to pick it up, and also speakers will do the same. Now, we are so privileged to have with us two wonderful speakers, two experts in this field who are following the negotiations on this new international legally binding instrument very, very closely, who have participated in the International Negotiation Committee meetings. There was first one last year in Uruguay, and just very recently the second one in Paris, and of course there are more to come. And we all know that the mandate for the negotiations comes from a resolution by the United Nations Environmental Assembly, who established the negotiation process in a way to negotiate that legally binding instrument in the course of 2 years. It is supposed to be finalized and adopted by 2024. It's an extremely short timeline, and it has been proven, and I think that's what we're going to hear more about today from our experts. It has been proven to be a real challenge. It is a global issue. It is an issue of global interest, but also global impact, where collective interests are at play, but also regional and specific interests of parties, in order to address something that is of course of concern to the global community. So we will hear a little bit where we are, what's happened in Paris at INC2, but also what are the next steps. We know that the most important outcome was the agreement by parties to give the chair of the INC the mandate to develop a zero draft, the first kind of negotiation document which will inform the next step of the negotiations. And that's supposed to be developed together with the secretariat who supports the chair. But this is enough from me. I don't want to foreshadow any of the discussions and deliberations that will come. We have with us today Professor Alexandra Harrington. Alexandra is the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law's task force on the negotiations of that new legally binding treaty to address plastic pollution. And Alexandra has been very, very active, worked together with the IUCN Secretariat on this issue, following the negotiations, legally supporting the IUCN Secretariat, but also working with a number of partner countries to enhance their capacity to participate meaningfully in the negotiations. And we have with us as well Carina Siegwards. Carina works with the IUCN Secretariat in Gland in Switzerland. Karine is the Senior Policy Advisor on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution and Trade. And she is leading the IUCN delegation and is a lawyer too. So she understands very well from a legal perspective what is happening, both substantively, procedurally, but also what are the wider implications for the general field of international environmental law. And we are very much looking forward to hearing both from you, but we will start with you, Alexandra. You're very welcome and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you all for being here. It is lovely to see you all, and it is lovely to be reunited with Karine because we spend such intense times together during the negotiations, and then we go apart. So it's lovely to be reunited. So I have a short presentation just to give a bit of a background, and then obviously, please, any questions, feel free. And I thought that if we had a presentation, then we could get more direct insights from Karine without having to have all the background done. So I will very much happily have that function. So Christina has already very kindly mentioned so much of the background, but in terms of how did we get here, we know that this has been a several-year process. And just as we have a short time period to address the actual process of creating the treaty, we have a bit longer history of how we got here. But essentially, we know now from scientific information, from technical information, that we need to bridge the science behind understanding plastic pollution and its harmful effects on the environment, on biodiversity, and on human health, with the legal ability to create something that is at the national and international level, a regulatory process. So with that in mind, we then had the UNEA resolution in May of last year. It seems impossible that it was only a year ago, and yet it was. And this resolution gave the authorization to create the INC and to start the process of having negotiations towards a plastics treaty. So a treaty addressing plastic pollution with an emphasis on the marine environment. And I mention this because there is often some concern or some lack of clarity as to whether, first of all, this would be only marine plastics, and it won't. It is intended to cover the entire life cycle of plastics. So everything from the creation on land to the use on land to then the disposal on land or in water. It's also intended to be a treaty that that looks at the various types of plastics. So not just one type of plastic, not just plastic bags, not just single-use plastics, although doubtless that will certainly be a very strong component of it. But it is intended to look at the entire plastic pollution chain. It is not necessarily intended to be in any way an outright ban on plastics. And so I keep mentioning this every time I speak about it, because there were, in the beginning at least, reports and mixed messages in popular press, et cetera, about what the scope might be. And because of that, it is, I think, very important to mention that while there are efforts to address the idea of banning single-use plastics, and I think Karine will talk about certainly the IUCN position on that, which is, I have to say, very innovative and progressive, but that type of ban is one thing. The idea of banning overall is quite different. And so there is no idea of banning plastics outright at this point, scientifically and practically. We also know that is not yet possible, although also the idea is to promote alternatives as well. So once we had the authorization to have the negotiations, we then move forward. And so we had our first meeting of all of the parties, all states that wanted to be participants, and we had over 140 states at that point come together, first in Uruguay. And I mention now the issue briefly of operating rules, because it is one that I see smiles on Christina and Karine's face. If we're talking about the timeline, I should mention it here because the operating rules of procedure for how the process would be conducted, how the negotiations would be conducted, were initially agreed to in Senegal, in Dakar. In May of 2020, there was the authorization to have this process start. And then after that, the rules of procedure were adopted as draft rules. At INC1 in Uruguay, there was an agreement to adopt these as then the draft rules of procedure for the negotiations. Not for the treaty, not necessarily for its implementation, but for the negotiations. And I mention this because it was a bit of something that was left over as a residual issue. Some parties felt that there was an issue to be addressed in Paris in subsequent discussions. And so it became very much a factor in the negotiation process at INC2 and took a great deal of time because of a specific voting question. So I don't want to get into that yet, but I do want to mention that in our timeline, it is important to note that the rules of procedure also came to us quite early, although how they have been interpreted was and will likely continue to be something that comes up throughout the entire negotiation process. There we are. So our deadline is the end of 2024 with the hope of adopting the treaty in 2025. This is quite ambitious. And as Christina has mentioned, we had our first meeting in Uruguay. We had our second meeting. This is actually should be changed to not last week, but several weeks ago in Paris. I wish it was last week. I wish we were still in Paris, but you know. Our subsequent meetings will be negotiating rounds will be in Nairobi in November, and then INCs 4 and 5 will be next year in respectively Canada, in Ottawa, and then in South Korea. We're not yet sure of the locations. At this point, these are scheduled to be 5-day negotiation rounds, as the others have been. There has been discussion during INC2 of potentially needing to make this a longer time frame, of perhaps maybe a week plus a weekend, so 7 days, perhaps maybe 10 days, perhaps maybe the full 2 weeks. We don't have any agreement on that yet, but it is certainly a very tight time frame. And since a lot of the INC2 time was taken up with procedural issues, it is quite likely that we will see that in the future. So we may get to spend even more time in one of those lovely areas in the future. In terms of core issues, things that were carried forward from Punta del Este in Uruguay onwards were issues like structure, elements, core obligations, binding versus voluntary obligations, the implementation mechanisms, and procedural issues. And most of these were still left quite open after Paris. So when we have the zero draft will be addressing the issue of core obligations. It will be addressing some aspects of implementation. There is a wide call in some quarters to have a full zero draft. So addressing more than just these issues, but those were the issues that we discussed in the contact groups during INC2 to the extent that we were able to have them. And so what happened in our scheduling nutshell is that we were scheduled to have a Monday and a Friday plenary session, with the rest of the week being for negotiations on the contact group topics. Unfortunately, due to the procedural issues that were raised, which came into the question really of voting and voting rights during the INC process, and whether there would be the ability to have a majority vote should consensus be unable to be achieved or not, came to the forefront. And this took a great deal of time. As a result, we had approximately a day and a half to address the core obligations questions and the implementation questions. So we didn't necessarily see as much of a concrete set of recommendations that had been discussed in depth as we might have liked. So we'll see what is in the zero draft, and that should be hopefully coming out in late September or early October of this year. for us to look at in advance of INC3. But those are very much critical questions. The other, for those who are truly legal policy connoisseurs, you will understand what this is. I'm trying not to say the word nerd, as my husband would say to me, but there are bracketed portions of the authorization for the zero draft around the idea of scope and also principles. So it is possible that we will certainly see submissions that are that have been submitted from various state parties reflected in the zero draft that focus on scope and principles as well. But all of these issues are still very much up for discussion and debate, and certainly scope and principles will be the subject of many of the contact groups at INC3. What else do we need to know? Do we not know? What else is up in the air? Many things. We don't know the structure yet. There has been an increasing discussion around the idea of using annexes. Interestingly, there has not been as much of a discussion as we heard in Punta del Este, certainly, as to whether that would be annexes in what tends to be assumed would be a specific convention context, or whether it would be a framework convention. That was very much silent, that issue, during the Paris discussions. But the assumption does tend to be that whether we have one or the other, there will be annexes, and there will be a number of them addressing plastics that are banned, plastics that are to be regulated, how that would work, particular polymers and substances. So something more likely along the lines of what we've seen in Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm. But we don't quite know yet what the format would be. And it could also be a hybrid structure as well. No need to explain that to lawyers, so that's all good. But what else do we need to think about? And do we not yet have consensus on? Nearly everything. The preamble. We have seen a number of ideas and suggestions for things going in a preamble and then not being repeated in the text. So placing things that might be a bit more controversial to some states in the preamble, and then not having them as legally binding obligations. We shall see. Perhaps one of the most critical elements for this particular treaty is the question of definitions. And of the interlinkages between science and legal policy for definitions. Because at heart, we don't necessarily have agreements on things like what would we use as a definition for circular economy? What would we use as a definition even of plastics in some instances? So the need for definitions is quite critical. And I think we saw that a great deal in Paris, because we saw that there were so many terms that were commonly used, but without any sense of common understanding. And as we move forward in the treaty negotiation process, this will, and certainly the treaty implementation process, this will be quite critical to address. And it really is a unique time in terms of looking at how we can bridge science and law into this treaty in the definitions context, while also keeping it relevant, while also keeping the definitions at least malleable enough so that what we know about plastics in 5 years or in 10 years can be properly reflected within the terms of the treaty, which is of course a challenge, but it's also quite critical as there is more of a stress on research and development in the concept of plastic futures or transitioning away from them. The objectives, again, highly contentious. There are some states that have advocated for a very short objective section that really looks at taking what was in the UNEA resolution and copy and pasting it. There are others that want something that is quite in depth. So there is a lack of agreement at this point. The scope, we will see what the discussions are in Paris, and we will see what is in the zero draft. We'll also see what for future issues comes up in state submissions. And the agreed upon timeline, I should mention here, for submissions is that, again, as in advance of Paris, observer entities like IUCN will be able to put in their written statements in advance of INC3 in mid-August of this year. So Karina and I will be spending a great deal of time working together. We'll have legal briefs, and then Corinne always does this incredible job of framing all of the policy statement. Those will go in on August 15th. And then on September 15th, the states will have their deadline to submit their own views. After that, we will then see the zero draft, and we will also see how those are incorporated into the agenda for INC3. Questions of fundamental principles will be critical as well. And a number of issue areas are coming up. Certainly, I think one of the things to flag here is moving forward, the debate between using common but differentiated responsibilities as language versus capacities and capabilities, national capacities and capabilities, which is what is in the language of UNEA and the resolution. So we will see the core obligations versus the binding obligations. We will have a greater sense from the zero draft as to where there may be consensus. And the thing to remember about the zero draft is that it is critical that we have one in advance of INC3, given the time frame, but it is also not legally binding. So if there are changes that states would like to see, if there are feelings that is not necessarily reflective of what certain states would like, they are entirely within their right to completely change that structure. And I mention this because I have had conversations with some states where there is a concern about that, about being wedded to whatever is in the zero draft and not being able to work outside of it. So I really wanted to clarify that. And also, just quickly, other issues that we will see coming up will include things like national action plans. Some of this will be mentioned in the implementation aspects of the zero draft, but this will be quite critical. And there is now a very in-depth discussion as to whether we use national action plans, whether we use national implementation plans, whether we use both, and national reporting, oversight measures and compliance measures generally. And then issues such as capacity building, technology transfer, mutually agreed upon assistance, also a financial mechanism, other subsidiary bodies, the dispute settlement system quite clearly, but also how this as a treaty body then has its own scientific policy bodies, but also intersects with and interacts with the proposal to have a science policy body similar to IPCC and IPBES for the pollution context, which is something that Corinne and I are also working on for development along the same time period. It is being proposed, it has been proposed through another UNEA resolution, and it is being currently negotiated as well in a separate set of negotiations. So how that comes into play will be critical. And so lingering issues quite quickly, procedural issues. The agreement at the end of the debate, so we could move forward to the contact groups, was very much focused on acknowledging in the record and in the report of the INC that there were disagreements over how to have voting and whether it would have to be consensus or whether there would be the option for a majority vote. The sense of many of us is that this could come back again. And it could come back again in future INCs. So it is something that will need to be addressed in future. And certainly when we think about the rules of procedure for actually implementing the treaty, this will be something that will be quite an in-depth discussion. The ability to have substantive guidance before the zero draft is quite critical. The ability of states to put in their additional comments and information for the things that are bracketed, so for scope and principles, will be critical. There is an identified need for intersessional work, although at this point there is no plan to have dedicated intersessional work other than a one-day pre-INC3 event that will happen the day before, so November 12th, the day before the INC starts. The plan is also to do this in a regional basis, regional grouping basis in Nairobi. We will see how that happens, but it is something where a number of regions have said they would like to do their own work anyway, regardless of whether there is a mandate to do so. And certainly we saw a number of issues addressed for intersessional work. Divergences and also general similarities in substances have been identified. So we need to figure out kind of how we move forward from those. And I would guess that the discussions of the zero draft in its infancy will really tell us a great deal about how strongly those positions are tied together. And then the expectations for forward movement. So how do we make sure we get to 2024 and we actually have a treaty that we are all marginally happy with to get us to 2025 and the actual adoption? This is something that we will see. And it's something that in honesty, there was a bit of, I think, hesitancy about, certainly by the midweek of our negotiating week in Paris, because so much time had been spent on procedural issues. So we really need to try to find ways to keep that momentum going legally, but also from a policy perspective and from a civil society perspective to move that forward and to make sure that we are able to address things like just transitions and the social aspects and the human rights aspects that are increasingly coming into the plastics treaty negotiations as well. So I will stop talking. I will stop sharing my screen and very happily turn over to Karine for insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you so much, Christina, also. And thanks to all those who are listening, participating to this webinar, because I think it's really important that we have these synergies with the World Commission on Environmental Law and the IUCN Secretariat. We have been working so close together, and it's really an advantage from IUCN that we can gather this whole expertise all over the world, namely also the legal expertise, because as Alex pointed it out, it's really important that we have this legal background going in these negotiations. So from my side, I just wanted to give you some more policy insights and not gossips, but policy insights, how we did feel and live, and also the way forward for the future during these negotiations. Perhaps first of all, speaking about policy, IUCN issued a position paper in front of INC1, who gathers the whole input and also insights and interests of IUCN within these negotiations. And this position paper can be downloaded on the website. It's in English, French, and Spanish. And we updated this policy, or this position paper, in a policy brief in front of INC2 to be a little bit more concrete what is on stake for IUCN with these negotiations. Importantly, we have 2 resolutions from Congress out of Marseille from 2021 who give really an ambitious and strong mandate for action for IUCN. First of all, regarding single-use plastic products, we have the mandate from Congress to stop the pollution out of single-use plastic product by 2025, and stopping all pollution of plastic by 2030. So this is really ambitious. And when we look at others, the High Ambition Coalition, where over 70, I think, countries now are participating, they have 2040 as a deadline for stopping plastic pollution around the world. So 2030, it's rather around the corner, but in my opinion, and this is also something the World Commission on Environmental Law could have a closer look on it, 2030 is also the Agenda 2030, which gives some timelines on SDG 12, for example, and 2030 is also a deadline under the Biodiversity Convention and the Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think we could argue here also from a legal and convergence perspective in treaties that 2030 is a timeline that could be also find its way in the plastic treaty negotiations. Regarding the what we as IUCN had heard through our projects and experience in 10 years all over the globe, in different regions, in small island developing states and everywhere in Africa also, there is a need that we have a closer look on the component of plastic products. So chemicals of concern should be prohibited, not only on 2040 or 2030, but starting to have a closer look on these chemicals and additives in plastics that are harmful and prohibit them from the very beginning. What we also heard, and we think it's important, is that the infrastructure and technology in developing countries must be performed and promoted. And this means that developed countries have a responsibility to help these countries in getting the infrastructure for a circular economy approach developed and financed and supported. And finally, it's also important not only to have a closer look on the production side. It's not only in the responsibility of the consumer, but on the production side, that overall production has to be reduced. There are a lot of products that are produced by economic interest, but at the end, they are either only used one time or not used at all, and they find their way in other countries by trade and are leaked in the environment. So this production overall should also be reduced. These are the main components of the position of IUCN, what is to do and by which measures. And these you can also find in the policy brief I mentioned. On the other hand, from a legal point of view, it's important to reflect that there are a lot of parallel processes. Alexandra touched upon it because if other entities and also other conventions, they are dealing partially about the issue on stopping plastic pollution. This is the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm conventions, for example, and they had just a conference of the parties and addressed some issues that are important. But also the WTO and the negotiation process within the WTO for the ministerial conference taking place next year has also an issue on plastic pollution. Importantly also that they are really engaged in this dialogue on plastic pollution, a lot of countries, and the same are also in the INC. But, and this is a little bit my feeling, partly with another ambition, and this is interesting to see. So coming perhaps to Paris, I want to make 3 comments. The first, I had the honor to represent IUCN at the high-level meeting that was in front of the INC2. And it was interesting to hear from ministers that the ambition is really high and they called for urgent action. President Macron said, c'est une bombe à retardement. We have to act now and not to wait that a plastics treaty comes in force. We have to act now. And a lot of ministers from their perspective and national perspectives alluded what they are already doing. And I think this is important to know and to give more visibility all that has been done. We know very well, when I say we here in Europe, what the European Union is doing on this issue. And so it's important also to analyze the different instruments that the European Union has already issued on bans, on taxes, on incentives, on market mechanism, in order to learn perhaps and also transmit a little bit all over the world what is feasible and where we have lacks and where we have to have a closer look. Here I want to mention an IUCN study from our European office on circular economy and biodiversity, where they analyzed the different tools and instruments of European Green Deal and circular economy approaches, and had a closer look what the consequences for biodiversity are. This said, my second I want to say what I heard in Paris is that everybody mentioned the triple planetary crisis, so climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Everybody said that a future plastics treaty should serve to combat climate change, but also to stop biodiversity loss. But concretely, most of the delegates, they stopped and came to climate change, but biodiversity loss, that was not concrete at all. So I think one advantage from IUCN, or a role of IUCN, could be that we help to draft a plastics treaty that also is in line with the global biodiversity framework, namely with Target 7. And also with the High Seas Treaty, and that the learnings that we have from there, that we can take them also in the negotiations and the plastics treaty text for the future. And then lastly, coming to the negotiation at INC2 himself, Alexandra mentioned the procedure issue. It was really frustrating, I would say, but from my legal heart, it was really interesting to follow 2.5 days on the procedural matters. Here, I think the World Commission on Environmental Law could also act, because we face the same thing in the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention Conference of the Parties, also on voting issues, consensus versus majority. And if we have a look what happened now on the high seas BBNG just a few days ago, there we had a similar issue that one country mentioned that they not agree with the treaty, but they wanted to have it in a footnote, the disagreement. I think we will facing this issue in the future in environmental multilateral negotiations, the more and more and more. And perhaps World Commission on Environmental Law with the whole intelligence and science that you have, we can perhaps help to find ways out of these, I would say, not that helping discussions and negotiations on the content. On the content, Alexandra made a good wrap up, and I think now for us it will be important that we can give a submission by August 15th of IUCN, WCEL, and others, really strongly advocating also or showing the interlinkages that the future plastic treaty has with the global biodiversity framework, and also the High Seas Treaty, that we can really bring this also in as an evidence, but also regarding the other parallel processes, that we can show where is convergence and where we have already dealt with something in Basel Convention, for example, and this hasn't to be repeated or in the future plastics treaty, that we can really learn what we already have and bring it in a language that is understandable. And when I say this, and this is my last remark, we have a really interesting project, ongoing project with 5 West African countries, the AfriPac project, where we are helping these countries to bring in their interest in the negotiations of the INC. And this is, I think, really important, because the cooperation with these 5 countries can bring up some strong inputs from the whole region, from the African region, but also from other, namely developing countries within this treaty. We have to empower them. So this was my last remark, empower, and then thank you so much, because without the WCEL, we couldn't empower that much IUCN's position in this treaty process. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, both Alexandra and Karine, for this very interesting insight in general about what this is all about, but also what happened in Paris. It almost feels like we've been with you there from your explanations. It's an interesting moment in the negotiations where now, as you indicated, or both of you indicated, the move is towards this non-binding zero draft, which hopefully will gather a bit momentum on substance in going into INC3 later this year. Now, we have a couple of questions already. I have some questions, but I encourage the audience to ask more, but we start with the two that we have, and you may see them, but I can read them out. There's a question on that regime convergence that you both already talked a little bit about it. In this particular question, the issue is about what are the relations, if any, between the Basel Convention and the new proposed treaty. Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy. I know Karine, we've spent a lot of time together now, so I see her going like this, which means you answer. So I will I will answer. And then please jump in, Karine. So several points. First of all, it should be highlighted that the BRS Secretariat actually has a presence as an observer status at the negotiations. So they have been there from the beginning and able to make interventions where they deem appropriate. So there is at least that involvement. In terms of substance, what is quite interesting is that I was lucky enough to be part of the IUCN delegation that was at BRS. And there were definitely certain types of plastics issues, including the designation of a technical guideline on plastic waste that happened in the BRS convention in May that will certainly have an overlap. And what is, I think, really critical right now is to have a discussion about how we make these regimes work together, how we make them more of a mosaic for regulating together the issues of waste and pollution, rather than seeing BRS as a hindrance. And what we heard from a number of states was a concern, some far more vocally than others, that by having BRS already in existence and by having it entering into the plastics realm, this would be something where the plastics treaty itself should not go into. And I think that Karine and I actually know we had a number of discussions about this and how that's not necessarily the case and how one wouldn't preclude the other, but we do have to structure very carefully. Karine?
Karine, would you
Yes.
like to add?
Yes, I want to add. I was just looking for my micro. I want to add two things. First of all, you have the Basel Convention. This is dealing with waste and also with the illegal traffic of waste. A lot of developing countries were concerned by the trade of waste and also the illegal trade of waste, plastic waste. And so in the Basel Convention, we addressed this issue, but in the Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention, where the chemicals are listed that are of concern or harmful or prohibited, or where you have information, sorry, my hands are always before my head. Sorry about that. I will keep them here. In the Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention, you have the chemicals that are listed for because they are prohibited, or because there is a need of information when they are crossing the border. So at the last COP, one chemical was prohibited that's also you can find in plastic products. And what I meant before I said the chemicals of concern in certain plastic products could be regulated also or listed under these two conventions. Yes.
Very good. There's another question on single-use plastics to which we will come, but if we can just stay for one moment longer on that issue of regime convergence that you already talked about. It's not just Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention, but you also indicated climate and in particular biodiversity. And so far, you know, everybody, as you said, was addressing the triple planetary crisis, but it didn't go much beyond rhetorics, or it was then just limited to climate change. But what would be suggestions or ideas of how to enhance that regime convergence so that it's not yet again another siloed international treaty, but it's really integrated or is integrating into the existing framework? And what may have to come from the other treaties? It's now integration goes usually, you know, both ways. Do you have any thoughts, any ideas, or something that you've heard that you found constructive?
I see the
Alex?
look, Corinne. So yes, I will
Yeah.
start that up. So actually it's something that I think we haven't gotten necessarily to the point of discussing yet, but something I think to keep in mind is that there will need to be joint work, right? And so whether it's an informal dialogue, informal partnership and discussion body, whether it's a formalized discussion body, I think that we will need to think in the plastics treaty context about building that in some way to the structure. And then as we move forward, whether it's for the triple planetary crisis, so we have a discussion body between all three conventions, or if it's plastics and UNFCCC, plastics and CBD, that will be quite critical. And I think also when we're looking at the framing language, certainly putting the references directly from the beginning in the preamble, perhaps in the objectives, and there have been some suggestions about including it in the objectives, seeing what might be done with the principles as well, so that when we're looking at not only the core binding terms, but also the interpretive elements, we can see where these nexuses lie. And I think it is perhaps not a bad idea to really be quite honest and reference in the treaty these interconnections and reference the fact that these all do need to work together, so that legally there is that established relationship from the outset. Now, again, for the other treaties, that's a different discussion of what might have to be added. And I certainly don't think anyone wants to open up the idea of adding things into treaty text, but creating some other type of governance body would, I think, be quite useful. Corinne?
Yes, perhaps two issues on that. First of all, in the parallel processes, the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution Prevention is also negotiated, the establishment. And there the same questions arise. That means how the three panels would work together, because they have to inform each other. And so this is an issue here from the science side. And I would also say that on the implementation side, when we're talking about national action plans, for example, that there these treaty conversions, namely with the big ones, I would say, will be really important, because we cannot, as you said, Christina, in the silos make these national action plans, because you will decide something on pollution that is against the objectives of climate change or biodiversity or other, or Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm. So this will be really important on a national level in implementation. And you can path the way for this convergence or cooperation between the different treaties in the treaty itself, like Alexandra said. And at the end, we have also the SDG process. So perhaps, I know it's not that legally binding that we wished it should have been, but this is certainly also something, a procedure that can help to get this treaty convergence.
Thank you so much to both of you. Let's go back to the questions that I put here in the Q&A. There are two questions that deal with the issue of single-use plastics. I think, Alexander, you mentioned that it is perhaps not feasible that there will be a ban on plastics in general, but maybe more straightforward with regard to single-use plastic. And the question is, how may single-use plastics be dealt with in the treaty?
So as of now, there does seem to be at least a consensus around the need to ban, from most states, to ban single-use plastics. And the questions there fall to, first of all, how are we defining single-use chemically, scientifically? What then would be the alternatives? Are we going to discuss alternatives? Because there is a great deal of scientific uncertainty as to whether something like a biodegradable plastic would actually be a better alternative, or whether that would have its own host of issues as well. And then the timeline for the potential ban. So we have heard some countries not want a timeline. Some countries say we should have it as a ban, but not put in a timeline. Others, including High Ambition Coalition, which is a larger group of multiple states, wanting a more advanced timeline. So suggesting either 2040, 2020 would be great, 2040 or 2050 as the deadline. And then certainly we have seen from IUCN perspective that the suggestion is far earlier, as Karina has articulated. There does seem to be a great deal of emphasis right now on the idea of 2040 being a target date. But no matter what, there will be, I think, some effort to make sure that there is a ban on single-use plastics in the core treaty text, regardless of what other types of plastics there are. And we also do need to think about whether that would be in an annex in terms of what is single use. So how do we define it? Are we putting it in an annex, or are we leaving it to national decision making, which then gets into a whole host of other questions.
Just to add that in the WTO context, they are discussing the same, because at the end it's a trade issue, and such kind of bans, if they are globally introduced with the treaty, or if they are nationally, because so far a lot of countries, they have certain bans on single-use plastic products. So the WTO will also have a point of view on that, and they negotiate a kind of list, what could be possible as a banned, but through national policy. I think it will be important to distinguish if in the future plastic treaty there is a global ban with an annex and listed, or if we aim to stop plastic pollution from single-use plastic products, and give some examples what they are, as you said, Alex, in an annex, and leave it up on national level to do so. And that's then not a trade relevant measure that would be prohibited or challenged through WTO.
Very, very interesting point. Another element of regime interaction, carving out exceptions under WTO, which would otherwise or could otherwise run afoul the rules of the World Trade Organization. We have another question here that is inquiring about this issue of circular economy, which you already mentioned, both of you, Alexandra, in the context of where is it currently in the treaty, and is it going to find any more definition? We have a question: is that the life cycle approach to plastic, is this wishful thinking, or are we going to see much more detail in the treaty? Especially, would it also include corollaries, like the by-effect, side effects of a life cycle assessment that may also include certain trade-offs that we may not be all aware of at this current stage? And I think Alex, you also spoke about the need for the treaty to be flexible and to evolve with evolving science, that we may not know everything right now, but have to have a dynamic treaty that evolves with science. But on circular economy and life cycle, how realistic? How will it look like? What shape will it take?
Yeah, I will go first and then leave the last word to Corinne. I think that's far more appropriate. I think at this point, it will be included, certainly in the treaty, and I think there will be a good deal of definition to it at some level, because we have heard so many states request this, because it is something that universally, whether we're talking about developed states, developing states, small island states, there is a call for. The question really is the prioritization of phases as to where do we start, and the recognition of the scope of the plastics problem being so huge on a global scale as well as multiple national scales. The debate really is, do we start and emphasize first the production aspects? Do we go to the upstream? Do we start with the downstream, so the disposal of waste and then what happens to it afterwards segment? Or then do we prioritize the midstream, where we're thinking about design and we're thinking about the use of plastics once they have been created upstream? And there is no magic answer. But we certainly have heard a number of different positions on what we need to do and why we would need to emphasize all of them, or each one of them, but I think they will all be included. And the other issue that tends to not be as discussed, at least not yet, but is, I think, quite critical to think about when we're looking at life cycles, is the question of under downstream remediation and legacy plastic. Because there's so much of the life cycle discussion is on forward looking, and this is obviously appropriate. What do we do in the future in terms of, creating polymers, using products and creating products and then disposing of them? But there will be, even if we had a treaty tomorrow, there will be the issue of legacy plastics, and where we put that in the life cycle, or whether that is a separate discussion, a separate legal requirement, is something that I think will be quite critical as we move forward to making sure it's addressed. Corinne?
You have said everything, Alex. No, I think you will certainly find the word circularity or circular economy in the future plastics treaty. I think this is evident. But when coming to the question of production and then consumption, then it's rather difficult, because there are some countries with strong economic interest on the production side, and this means also oil and gas issue. And so we will have to see, but everybody, I think, agrees that circular economy is of the benefit of a lot of people. It's also in economic interest, and there is the business coalition with big multi, how do you say, like Nestle and Coca-Cola and other enterprises and industry that are strongly bringing this issue forward from a circular economy perspective, and also from the production side, not only consumption, and bring forward the issue of alternatives and substitutes. So I think it will find a way in the treaty to circular economy, also because of economic interest, but it will be very, it has to be in a just way, this transition, because although we're talking about the transition, and there the waste pickers, for example, and the informal sector, they will have something else, or they have to be also reflected in the treaty in a way that this transition is a just one, and taking in account also their economic interest. And also two other important actors for the circular economy, these are the municipalities, because a lot of permits for waste collection and infrastructure is on municipal level, also the regulation. And for the implementation, the municipalities will worldwide be important to be considered. And yes, the small and medium enterprises will also be important to put this circular economy upstream, midstream, and downstream in place. And they are really advocating that they are reflected in the treaty in some way. And from the scientific point of view, the Future Science Policy Panel could also give some advice how circularity is in line with environmental impact and social impact and economic impact. And this was also asked from a lot of delegates that socio-economic impacts should be more brought forward in this process and bring the data in. And I think also here IUCN could play an important role, because these kind of data or work or activities, we have this mission to do so also.
Very, very interesting. We are running a little bit against the end of our time, but we have one more question, and then I give the floor back to both of you to give some final remarks or comment on what you've heard from the other speaker. Alex, you already talked about legacy plastics. You mentioned that there's another question on how far microplastics will be included in the treaty. You know, it's a similar question, but again, I give the floor back to both of you, and also for some final remarks before I then quickly wrap up.
Perfect. And again, I want Corinne to have the last word so quickly. Yes. So I think obviously legacy plastics are being discussed, not as much as they should be, but they are being discussed. And certainly some groups like AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States, very much has placed this as a core tenet of its position. So I think that's very important from that perspective. In terms of microplastics, absolutely, there is a discussion about the inclusion of microplastics. And again, that gets to the question of, will this be a core obligation? Specifically, will it be referred to as a type of plastic that then is regulated in an annex? And whether we define that in what microplastics might be scientifically in the definition section of the treaty, or if we leave that open for future questions. So similar discussions with nanoplastics and with other forms of plastics are going on as well. And so we'll see, but it's definitely being discussed. And just as a final word, and then pass over to Corinne. I think it's really important, and Corinne, you referenced this in terms of just transitions, which is something that we've already developed a WCEL policy paper on, and we have a number of them. So if anyone is interested, we're happy to share that information. And we are working quite hard for more of those before the August 15th deadline. But the idea of regime convergence, I think, is important to remember in this treaty context, not only for other MEAs and for other environmental agreements, and also, of course, for trade, but also that this is a human rights issue as well. And we've seen many human rights bodies present. We've seen WHO, we've seen ILO involved, multiple aspects of the various human rights treaties, the core treaties at the international level and also the regional level will play a part in this, will have overlapping interests. So that is one of the things that makes this such a frustrating, potentially, but certainly a fascinating treaty negotiation and treaty process, is that there are so many different components to plastics. So as we move forward, I would expect that these discussions start to increase and that we see more of this type of emphasis as well. So it will be interesting. So thank you, Corinne.
What we have seen in Paris is that the delegation from countries, the governments, are now in a negotiation mode. This means for IUCN and for other organizations and observers and stakeholders, we have to step a little bit back, or we are a little bit more in the background now. But this doesn't mean that we can lean back do nothing. So the next weeks until the 15th of August will be very important, also to gather all what you mentioned today. I would say treaty convergence, but also legacy plastic, the microplastic issue, about definitions, about procedures. So it will be important that IUCN addresses this issue, how we could incorporate these concerns, but also what we heard from our AfriPac countries, for example, how we could address these concerns in a future plastics treaty or zero draft. And for this, we are planning to do some webinars, or yes, in front, not only of the submission deadline, but also afterwards in front of INC3. And it is planned that one will take place in July, and we'll have a closer look at what you mentioned, Christina, with the circular economy. What does this mean concretely? And also the interlinkages with biodiversity. And we will dedicate this webinar on that issue together with its more in-house IUCN webinar with the Commission and regions. Then a second webinar just after the submission will be on the health issue, on the human rights issue, and on just transition. There we will want to work together with WHO and ILO and also the Human Rights Officer in Geneva. And also our water team, for example, because plastic pollution is also a freshwater issue and health issue with this. And the third one, just in front of INC3, where we will have a closer look on the zero draft. So we will use this time and bring in the IUCN interests and positions, but also what is the advantage of IUCN means the nature conservation focus, but the people also, they live in nature, and bring this voice in the negotiations and in the legal text. Thank you so much.
Well, the thanks is on our side here. Alexandra, Karina, thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to be with us, to share with us your insights, but also to answer all these very interesting questions. But thanks in general for the important work that you're doing in the context of the negotiations, but also in supporting the partner countries that we have. And some thanks goes also to NORAD, the Norwegian Development Agency, who supports IUCN in this work. And of course, thanks goes to the audience who has been with us here today and for your questions. Now, if you want to rewatch the seminar today, or if you had not time to listen to it, it's being recorded, and we will put it on the IUCN World Commission's website in due course, together with all the other webinars in this webinar series that I mentioned in the beginning. Now, the work of the IUCN, as Karina and Alexandra said, the position papers and the policy papers are publicly available. You find them on the IUCN website on different topics and more to come. These are in-depth analyses of particular issues, and I can only recommend to have a look at them and see what we're working on. I also noted that Alexandra published a very interesting blog post at the the Climate Law Network that is also part of WCEL's climate law team on the interlinkage between climate change and climate regime and plastics. And we will also see if we can do similar analyses of inter-regime reaction with biodiversity and with the other relevant treaties, in particular human rights and so forth that you mentioned. That's a very interesting deep dive into the potential that is there that both Karina and Alexandra mentioned. And with that, again, many thanks to you, and all the best in whatever comes your way. I'm sure you will make a difference. Thank you very much. Stay safe and see you soon.